I am different than a lot of entomologists in that I wasn't a kid who was running around collecting insects and digging through the dirt. Most entomologists that you talk to have been really passionate about insects from an early age. It's not like I didn't like them, it just wasn't my main interest. And so I really didn't develop this interest in insects and in that whole world until I was in kind of my early 20s, which is when actually I first became interested in biology, which I came to from an interest in conservation. So I'd started, I'd always been kind of, as a kid, I always loved nature shows and learning about nature and loved hiking around, but I didn't get really passionate about it until I started spending a lot more time out in nature, really doing some serious camping and outdoor time, and just got that natural curiosity going with wondering how things worked. And really seeing a need for conservation, as anyone who spends time in natural areas, once you start learning about them, you see how few of them they are, and how even they are all, the natural areas that we do have are all getting smaller, all have threats kind of coming in from the edges. So it was really from getting an interest in conserving nature that I first started thinking about insects. And I came to that pretty quickly as soon as I was interested in the environment and interested in conservation. It became really apparent that insects are the most diverse, the most abundant life form on the planet. And as such, they're doing all these really important things in the environment, all these ecological services. And when you then looked at what was being done for conservation work, there was very little talk about insects. That's changing a bit now, but back when I was first interested in it, there were maybe a few butterflies that people would be concerned about. And just knowing that they did all these amazing things, and that we needed to work to preserve them, that really excited me as seeing an area that needed a lot of attention and work, and seeing a space where I could go in and start that work was something that was got me excited about working with insects. And then once I started learning more about them, the world just kind of opened up. There's the whole world of insects is really fascinating, and there's so many behaviors that they're doing. I first was interested in social insects, which I think appealed to me because I had been interested in anthropology previous to that. So it was kind of this, understanding social structures, and then seeing that these things with tiny brains could be doing, having wars, slavery, cooperation, all these intense social structures was fascinating to me. So I first started out in the insect world with ants, which are still, people I think are still kind of learning about how important ants are in terms of their ecological services. So they're really important for turning over the soil. They're the most abundant thing on the planet is actually ants, aside from just insects. Ants take up more space more biomass than anything else on the planet. And as such, they're doing all these amazing, important things. But it was when I volunteered for a project that was looking at insect pollinators in prairies that things really clicked, where it's like, okay, these things are out here, they're moving pollen around, they're helping these plants to reproduce. This is something that'll be a little bit easier to explain to people why these are important, why we need to work on conserving these creatures. So when I first started working with pollinators, that was really a a clear path of people still at that point in time, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, weren't really talking about how important pollinators were. But I knew that it was going to be an easier sell for people to understand that insects are important because they affect the food on your plate. They affect the food that's there for all these other animals that are out there in the world. So it was after I volunteered for this project, I spent a summer helping out, looking at insects out in the prairies. I got a chance to learn about plants, that I really learned about bees and developed a passion for bees, which I then was able to pursue academically. So I did a master's thesis looking at working mostly with bumblebees. I followed that by working for a conservation organization on their bumblebee program. I worked for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and got a chance to take that information that I had, that I'd learned, and transform it into kind of on-the-ground conservation work, which was something that had initially led me into this path. And then I was able to also come back and do a PhD at the University of Minnesota, expanding my world of bees from bumblebees to all bees. So learning about bee diversity in agricultural areas. And all of this has come around to the position that I currently hold as an extension educator, where I'm able to continue my research. So one of the things about working with insects in general is that there is a lot more that we need to learn about everybody and what they're doing, how they're functioning. So I get to continue with my research, but also continue with my passion for conservation by working with education with the public to share the research that we have, to engage people as citizen scientists to help us expand our knowledge base and really bring pollinator education to everybody in Minnesota.
So one answer to the question, why bees, is it's easy to explain to people why bees are important, and it's harder to explain to people why ants are important.
Yeah. I did just get seriously enthusiastic about bees. And part of it was, I think it was a really nice excuse to also learn about plants. And in their role as pollinators, where they have this connection with plants, I was interested in plants also. And I mean, ants interact with plants too, but with bees, it's a lot tighter connection. And so I had an excuse to also, through working with pollinators, kind of have a broader expanse of things I had an excuse to geek out on.
Yeah. Although I'll bet there's some weird fungi ant relations down there.
Yeah, there are some amazing things, and I mean, ants will do some pollination too. Well, they'll get in plants and move things around, and yeah, ants are. It's not for lack of fascination with ants that I didn't end up in the ant world.
Right. Well, I always like to go back before the beginning for just a minute. You started in anthropology, or at least with a strong interest in anthropology, and can you put this fascination with conservation and the environment in a little broader context of the interests, the broader interests that narrowed down to that?
Yeah. So my interest in anthropology, I think a lot of that came up from just being a young person in the world and trying to really figure out what it is to be human, what humans are, the different ways that we interact with the world, and by looking at different cultures and how different cultures, the different worldviews that people develop, the different ways that people treat each other in different societies and in different cultures. That I think that was an interest for me, partly to help me figure out the boundaries of what people are and what it is that people do. And part of that is seeing the different ways that different cultures, the different ways they interact with their outside environment, the different ways that different cultures can just have a more a less authoritarian relationship with the environment. A lot of Western culture has been European culture has been controlling the environment. We've figured out ways to support ourselves, but hasn't always been in tune with everything, with the natural world. And there are other cultures that have found ways to do that while they're still in tune with the natural world. So some of the interest in anthropology, helped me to see different ways that people can interact with nature. Humans being a part of nature, I firmly believe, but we tend to try to separate ourselves from it. But we can be a part of it and interact with it without having to dominate nature.
I took a bunch of cultural anthropology before the revolution that said something like nobody before 1995 is worth reading. That happened apparently in the field. And so I read those books that were tribe-specific or, sometimes homeless people specific, or those sorts of studies. And I didn't read, outrageous numbers of them, but I don't remember anything in any of the books I read that would have helped me in a career as an extension agent. In other words, there was a whole lot about, marriage patterns and a whole lot about, trade relations and a whole lot about ritual, and, people had different emphases, but I don't recall that the anthropology of conservation or the anthropology of interface with nature got much space. Now, did I just read the wrong ones, do you think? Or is this a kind of unexplored territory?
There is some work on it. So most of my anthropology reading was also pre-1992. So it's kind of in that era too, and some of it. There does tend to be a lot of details about family structure and all those kinds of things, and some of what I think I got out of it there was from that reading, and some of it was from more when I got into conservation and, reading about the more kind of philosophical readings about conservation, and then taking those views and going back and looking at the things that I'd read in anthropology and kind of putting that conservation perspective onto it. I wouldn't be surprised. I do believe there is a whole body of work that probably directly addresses kind of the cultural, environmental, nature relationships. But I think back when I was doing it, I was piecing it together where I could.
Yeah, and there's all this spooky stuff about how peoples who are no longer around managed vast tracts of the environment in ways that seem pretty attractive to us today in terms of diversity and resilience and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of anthropology one wishes someone were around and had been around in pre-Columbian times to find out how people thought about adding microorganisms to bad soil to make it good soil, and whether they thought about maintaining the pollinators.
Right.
Had any ideas about that?
Right. Yeah.
So ants and bees, people have written all these books saying, "I wish people were more like ants and bees." They're really, I mean, there are lots of things. Or, "Oh no, we're turning into ants or bees." I mean, there are two lines of speculative fiction out there, and it has to do always with a sense that what we get sort of just partly right, the ants and the bees get totally right, and the division of labor is perfect with ants and bees in a way that it never is with us. All that sort of talk. But all those people who talk that way don't spend more than about 20 minutes tops looking at actual ants and actual bees. I'm wondering, can you say a little bit about what happens when you look at ants and bees, social insects, for long times? Pay attention to what happens day after day. I mean, how does that romance develop, and what kinds of things excite you about these animals, insects, biological beings?
Yeah, I think some of the fascination is how different they are, and how efficient they are. But when you look at them, you can see, especially once you start tracking individuals, you can see a lot more variability in behavior, a lot more kind of chaos that's in the colony that may not be apparent when you just look, because I mean they are amazingly efficient, and they can get so much done with so little. I talked about their brains being so small. Not a huge cluster of neurons that have all these different behaviors programmed in there. But yeah, some of the fascination can come from just seeing how different they are than what we think they were. So, people, look at an ant. When you look at ants, especially when you're watching them, above ground, and you just see them working all the time, and people are amazed, and same with bees. You see them out foraging, and they're just going right to the flowers, doing this work, running back, flying back as fast as they can, helping out their sisters, doing all this stuff for cooperative good. And I think that's one of the things that people get excited about and have them as an emblem for something that we need to live up to, because they're such hard workers, and they're this selfless sacrifice. But then when you go inside of the colonies and you can watch the individuals, you can see that they actually do have a lot of downtime. There's a lot of, when you're tracking individuals, especially when you're watching an individual and waiting for it to do something, they'll spend a lot of time just sitting there. As with anything, the watched pot never boils. once you put numbered tags on the bees, then all of a sudden they spend a lot of time just sitting around. There's also a lot of social conflict within the colonies, and kind of fighting for control. So I worked a lot with bumblebees, which are they are social, but they're less advanced than honeybees or ants in terms of their social development. So you can see these points where there will be these conflicts for who's laying eggs, and they'll eat each other's eggs. They'll go and lay their own eggs. Kind of seeing that this complexity and these kind of struggles within this whole unit that appears to be cohesive, I think is an interesting thing that comes out once you spend time looking in the colonies.
I remember, just stopping at rest stops going west and happening on these ants in quantity. And I kept thinking, I'd watch one until I lost track. I needed a tag or colors or something. But, it seemed to be doing something senseless. It would push a piece of gravel off and then push another piece of gravel back up and kind of go sideways. The heap was clearly getting made, but when I tried to attribute some contribution to one of the ants I was watching, it didn't work. The ant was just sort of, it was the way I would proceed if I were sort of dumped into a giant construction project with no blueprint.
Yeah.
Move this around. No, maybe it belongs back here.
Yeah, that whole idea of the superorganism is really a real thing, where there's all these little bits and pieces, cogs in the wheel kind of thing, but the function of the whole thing is greater than the sum of its parts. There's all these qualities that emerge from the colony overall, all these individuals that are all existing together, turn into really an organism in itself. That you do when you're studying social insects, you need to kind of just look at the colony level of what they're doing as well as the individuals.
Well, I'm talking to people in biology, which is not my field. I just grab little bits of information from somewhere, and I remember the stuff I sort of learned about how flocks of birds move. That it looks as if it's an orchestrated dance, but you get an orchestrated dance if you give each bird two rules. Mm-hmm. One about how far to stay from the other bird, and some other rule. And then if all the birds do that, you get something that looks really special and also gets you south without a lot of dead birds, or north without a lot of dead birds. Now, is there, and do have people apparently have figured out how birds stay in formation without a really smart bird, Martha Graham of the bird world, mm-hmm. handing everybody little pieces of paper. Do people have it down for ants? Where they build, somehow or other an external thing of the colony of a particular shape is emerging. Do they have it figured out what the instruction is for each individual ant that makes that happen?
I think one of the problems is that there's so much variability in social insects. So there's all these ants doing things different ways. I think there's the basic piece of information that we know that it's a similar kind of thing, so there's some particular species where they've looked at, and and have figured out certain rules that they follow for how these, structures are end up getting created from all these individual things coming together. But yeah, we definitely don't have the whole rule book for all of them.
So do I understand the place of the research is people know what kind of thing has to be happening to make these social constructions happen, but they don't necessarily know what exactly is going on.
Right.
If they figure it's got to be something like the bird algorithm, but they don't know what. Is that the general picture?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
So, and this is an impossible question, but I wonder, how far are we along with social insects? Do we know pretty much what there is to know about social insects? I expect the answer to that is no. But are we back in the phlogiston era with regard to how they? Are we still? Is there a huge amount left to know that's really principal, important? Do you expect that what we think today may be totally overturned in 20 years? Is that possible?
There are some interesting things going on, even just in the last maybe 5 to 10 years with social insects, where in terms of just the biggest question with social insects is, why are they social? Why are these insects, why are they doing this? We can understand the benefits to being social, but there's sacrifices too. And so, starting out in the 1960s, the main idea was that it had to do with genetic relatedness. Most of the social insects have this different sex determination system where the females are diploid, like we are, with 2 sets of chromosomes, but the males are haploid. And then because of that, the sisters are more related to each other than they would be in just a diploid system. And so the thought behind why these females would sacrifice their own reproduction to take care of their sisters' young had to do with the genes are all getting out there anyway. But as we've learned more about social insects, there are huge groups of social insects that don't have that sex determination system, like termites. There are lots of social insects where the female mates multiple times, like honeybees. The queens can mate with 20 different males, and so then that dilutes the relatedness. And all these pieces of the puzzle in terms of that might be part of what's going on, but there has to be something else going on too. That can't be the main construct. And so there's been an interesting kind of body of research over the last 10 years where people and a little bit, people kind of realized sooner, of course, that there was all that wasn't the answer to everything, but still those questions of why and how things happened, it's really difficult to answer those questions overall. But we can see that there's things like looking at why living socially is a benefit can help you understand why groups became social. So things like being able to better defend yourselves, having these nest structures. There tend to be more groups that you see taking that path to social living when there's more competition for nest sites, when there's more need to defend yourself against predators. And so our, just recently, in terms of the scale of people studying social insects, those ideas of having that answer to why they're social, that's really been kind of turned on its head in a way. People can't just say, oh, that was always the first answer. Oh, it's the genetic relatedness. Now that genetic relatedness is viewed more as kind of like a glue that helps that behavior stay in place, where it's really these other factors that are causing these insects to live together, to stay together, that genetic relatedness can help to kind of keep that going over time. And so we have a lot, there's new work that comes out every year in terms of finding different groups of insects that have these social behaviors, in terms of understanding, especially looking at some of these insects that are variable in terms of sometimes they're social and sometimes they're not. More people are really kind of digging into those species to try to learn, well, what's the difference? Why are they sometimes social? Why are they not? To help us just understand kind of that point of where they become social. But by studying something like ants, all ants are highly social. And the same kind of thing if you just look at honeybees, they're kind of already committed to this super social lifestyle. There's a lot you can learn about the intricacies of what those social systems are, but in terms of understanding how creatures got that way and why they would stay that way, you really need to look at those more primitively social, the ones that are just sometimes social, sometimes not, to really understand more about the evolution of sociality.
Yeah. Well, I think about bats because they fly, not insects. I know that. They cluster in such huge numbers, but presumably they raise their own babies.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, one kind of wants to find the bat equivalent for insects, how it might have started before you start getting communal nurseries and specialized genetics, in these forms that sometimes are social and sometimes not. Do you start finding primitive precursors of the honking, organized stuff?
Definitely, yeah. So there are all kinds of different stages in between where sometimes there will just be sisters that stay in the nest where they were born, and the sisters will kind of guard each other's brood. But they don't have that division of labor. Everybody's still laying eggs, but they do this kind of cooperating to have a nest together, to defend it, to take care of each other's young. But they haven't taken that next step of one of the sisters not laying eggs and one of the sisters laying the eggs.
Well, I mean, when I try to sort of tell the evolutionary story here, you imagine, well, this thing changed and that thing's changed in the environment to force it that way. But is it possible that there are a whole bunch of switches that just are on the same circuit, so to speak, so that at some point it flipped very quickly? I mean, is that a going hypothesis, or are we talking? I mean, is the imagination of it that somehow or other these limitedly cooperative creatures came under some kind of pressure that pushed the more limitedly cooperative off the board and encouraged them to go hog wild in the cooperative. I mean, is that the story that's basically being told?
Yeah, along with there being certain kind of tolerances. So, characteristics that they might just already have for being able to tolerate being in a larger group. And there's lots of insects that do gather in groups. You talked about the bats being, all together in these caves. There's lots of insects that will just group together for, mutual defense. But not all insects do, so having that kind of tolerance for just being in a group is kind of a first step. There's actually a few different pathways that can be taken on that road to sociality. And it seems to take a while before it gets to that point where it's the switch and there's kind of the point of no return kind of thing. Bumblebees are kind of interesting in that they do have this whole phase in their cycle where they are solitary. So each year they're just starting from one female that survived the winter, and she has to do all the work for herself. There's wasps that are like this too, and it's not until she has her first brood of workers that come out that it really becomes a social colony. But bumblebees seem mostly committed to that social lifestyle, with the exception of some bumblebees that, and this happens in a lot of different social insects, where they, instead of starting a colony of their own, they'll just go into the nest of another bumblebee and start laying their eggs. And they again don't have workers because they don't have a division of labor. They're just going in and taking over and using workers that were already there. So there's these interesting switches, and then those species have completely committed to that lifestyle. They aren't able to start up nests on their own. They have to go into the nests of other social insects to be able to take them over. But there does seem to be this point where, with sociality, with the highly social species, things like honeybees and ants, they're not able to, the new queens that would be produced, they're not really able to just do anything on their own. They need the workers to help them. And understanding how it gets to that point where you can't switch, where you give up that flexibility to switch back, where there must be such benefit to living together that flexibility is lost over time. We're still kind of figuring out how that really happens.
We've had some conversation off camera and more conversation today about sort of the nuts and bolts of bee research, and today ant research. And the sense I have is that there's a lot of doing the same thing over and over again for many, many hours. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, research in general, there's a lot of counting things. There's a lot of repetition. For studying bee diversity, in order to understand how bees relate to environments, studying the bee communities, you need to do collections of insects, of the bees, because that's the only way you can identify most species. So then there's a whole slew of repetitive work that comes with collecting and labeling and properly storing all of these insect specimens.
So, and this is, I mean, like, how many hours a day during a time when you're actually in the field, you know, working with these things, are you basically looking at bee parts, trying to figure out which bee you have?
So I have spent a lot of time doing that. That was probably most of my thesis work. For every hour that you spend in the field, it's going to be 5 times that for out of the field and figuring out what you're doing. A lot of people do rely more. There are just a handful of experts that are really able to ID, and I did use experts to help me with identification, but it is possible also, if you get agreements with these experts, to give your specimens to them and they can ID. So I spent a lot of time looking through the microscope, learning to ID everything. Not everybody does that. And in general, once you get to know species, most of them can be identified pretty quickly. So once you've gone through all the work of getting to know the species, each individual bee, you look at it for a couple minutes and you can figure out what it is. Either that or you know that you don't know what it is, and maybe nobody knows what it is, and you need to set it aside and send it off to somebody.
Or it doesn't do to send off a picture?
Not usually. So there are, and more recently people have gotten better technology for taking pictures of bees. There's usually detailed areas that you need to look at on a lot of different parts of the bees at different angles. So it can be hard to get the right photo unless you know really what that person needs to look at. So it helps if you have it narrowed down to, it might be this or that. I'm looking at this part that's supposed to be able to tell me what's different, but I can't see it. I've done that with experts where I've taken a picture of a leg, of a particular structure on the back leg of the bee to go, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Is this what I think it is?
Yes.
But the photo stacking has really helped with that, because part of the problem with working with really small things is the plane of focus. It can be hard to have all the parts you need in focus in a photo. When you're working at the microscope, you're able to you're constantly adjusting the focus when you're working on IDing the bees, so you can get what you need to be in focus. But with photo stacking, you're able to get the plane of focus down through all these different kind of layers of the insect and have it all put together in one picture where all these different planes are in focus. So that has helped a lot.
So then you send it to someone who puts on his 3D glasses and looks around the bee the way you look around the Coliseum.
Someday we'll probably get that.
Well, I mean, the next question, I'm thinking, I want this to be an hour-long commercial for biological sciences, okay? I want somebody on this side of the camera to go be an entomologist or something. But there is the question, how do you avoid losing your mind with this much of the same stuff? I mean, I know, if you were, like assembling transistor radios, it would be the same deal, but they, you've been both trained and encouraged to develop a whole lot of electricity between your ears. And then, well, I've got 19,000 bees I have to look at one at a time. How does that work?
Well, with ID, it is really engaging your brain a lot. There's a lot of really focused attention and, deciphering what it is that you really need to see. I've found the ID work to be really engaging, and one of the interesting things with science, and we've seen, we also have undergraduate helpers that will come in and help us with the, pinning and labeling and some of those tasks, and you do see that it is the kind of thing where some people love it, and some people just are never gonna want to do it. So it's definitely not something that's for everyone. But the people that are engaged in it, it's just it can be kind of meditative, and I think I've always enjoyed that work where it is just kind of more meditative, and it's a nice balance as a scientist, to be able to have these different kinds of things that you're doing at different points in time, because there's times when you need to put all of your critical thinking skills at work, reading scientific literature and being critical of how people did things to make sure these results are making sense, make sure that you understand what they did. There's the kind of creative thought processes where you're, coming up with your ideas for how you have the questions you want to ask, but you need to figure out how you're going to answer them, and there's a lot of creative thinking in that. So you have all of these different parts of your brain that are really engaged in that, and then it can be nice to have a day a week or half a day where you just go and you just look at bees, and you can go up. I know what this is. You can get answers that are defined. You can have these tasks where you can see what you accomplished at the end, as opposed to a lot of the more abstract work as a scientist. Sometimes, if you're working with writing or just kind of planning, it is a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it's harder to look at your desk and see what you did. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the actual, when you're working with your data, when you're working with things like processing your specimens, IDing, you can see a definite physical accomplishment that you did.
I feel like referencing the latest scandal just because it seems important. Stephen Jay Gould long ago did this thing, just sort of this analysis of old studies of skull capacity, where basically people were determining that, the British researchers were determining that the Britons had much higher skull capacity than the French, and the French were determining that the French had the higher skull capacity. And this was supposed to tie to, the elephants were kind of forgotten about, but it was kind of the thought, because of course they beat everybody, but the thought was that, well, this is intelligence, and there's the point is, if you're using something compressible, you can cheat, and you have a reason to cheat, although it may not be obvious to you as you're doing it. Now, you're doing all of this identification. Each one of the bees is a judgment call. And, is it at all like that? do you have a favorite hypothesis? Is there a thing that could happen in this research that would just blow 5 years of your life? And how do you work with the fact, work with that whole level of consideration? Because you don't want to screw it up.
Right. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why you need to be so critical reading others' scientific literature, papers, products, and you need to be as critical with yourself. With the data collection, every time you're collecting data, you need to think about ways that you're going to control any inherent bias that you have. So if you're out collecting bees, you have to make sure that you're collecting in the same way in all kinds of different habitats. If you wanted to prove that there were more bees here and fewer bees there, you need to make sure you're collecting in ways that are consistent in both of those habitats, so that so that you're not putting that bias in there. There are so there's observer bias from yourself being there, the way that you're collecting. There's also just bias with different collecting methods in terms of what you would collect. Anytime you're going out and collecting, you're not going to get everything. What you get is a representation of what was there. And just by making sure that you're consistent, that's the way that you're really making sure that you're not putting that bias into your work. Once you have the specimens, that all is pretty straightforward in terms of this type of work. There are possibilities to and a general tendency that people have when they're IDing anything, IDing birds or plants or anything. People want to find the rare thing. So with the citizen science work I do, we get photos people send in from the public, and there's definitely more errors, more people thinking that they have a rare bee, fewer people making mistakes when they have a common bee. But the place where the most care is really needed is in the analysis of those data. So with statistics and the power of statistics, understanding why you're testing, making sure that your question is really clear before you start, so you're not just fishing around for an answer that you want, not determining the best test to use before you start using them, so you don't just keep on using different tests until you find one that gives you the answer that you want. There's kind of just ethical decisions that you need to, these ethics that you need to adhere to when you're doing science, to just make sure that you're not putting that bias in.
Well, am I understanding you to say, yeah, there's a problem, but this one's kind of under control? We know where the bias comes in. We have some pretty well-established ways of kind of keeping it out. Is that right?
Well, along with that vigilance, is something that's constantly needed. And the peer review process in science is something that really helps to maintain that vigilance. You can't just assume that everybody is adhering to the code of ethics like they should be. You have to be able to see evidence in terms of how they've laid out their study design, how they've addressed their potential biases, how they've said they were going to do their analysis, and how they did it. And an interesting thing with that, that I'm not sure how best to address this, but a thing that I think is the biggest gap is the point where that research exists, and then how that information comes to the public and how the public interprets it, because the general public, a lot of times they don't have even just access to read the original articles unless they have a subscription or unless they belong to a library at a university. They can't even read the scientific papers that are giving results that they're interested in, and all they can have access to is the way that the media interprets these studies. It's not that's where I think the biggest kind of twistings come in terms of taking things out of context, exaggerating parts of studies, and it's kind of out of control of the authors of the study once they become public, and once they're just picked up in the media. It's hard to know the best route to keep that information based in the reality of the findings.
So this becomes the job for the extension person.
Exactly.
So you've got both hats.
Exactly.